In the 19th century, European philosophy reached a consensus under G.W.F. Hegel. He proposed a universe governed by absolute logic, where every historical event and human action clicked into place within a vast, continuous system. Hegel argued that human consciousness evolves through a process of dialectical mediation. When contradictions arise, a thesis meeting its antithesis, they are not dead ends. They are rationally resolved, folded together into a higher, more complete synthesis. This framework offered immense comfort. It promised that there were no permanent tragedies or unsolvable paradoxes. Every historical conflict and personal crisis could ultimately be reconciled through the steady, inevitable expansion of rational thought. Follow this process to its end, and you arrive at what Hegel called absolute knowledge. At this terminal point, all of history and existence is finally understood as the deliberate, self-actualizing movement of spirit. Hegel constructed a magnificent, logically flawless palace of ideas. But in mapping the universal laws of reality, this perfect architecture omitted the specific, concrete reality of the existing individual trying to live inside it. Soren Kierkegaard positioned himself as the radical antagonist to this system. He set out to shatter the Hegelian palace, redirecting philosophy away from universal concepts and back toward the individual. Kierkegaard's core objection was precise. Hegel had mapped the entire cosmos with geometric clarity, yet in doing so, he completely forgot what it means to actually be a human being. Logic deals in necessity and universal rules, but human existence is defined by contingent choices, personal history, and an inescapable sense of anxiety. You cannot deduce the experience of dread or the weight of a moral choice from a mathematical formula. Therefore, the transitions in a person's life are not smooth dialectical syntheses. You cannot think your way into a new stage of life. You must enact it through what Kierkegaard called a leap, a willed, discontinuous jump across a void. Human existence is not an equation to be solved. It is a profound ontological tension, and it can only be navigated through the medium of passion. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard establishes a strict mechanical framework for human nature. The self is a synthesis of opposing forces. One side is the finite, the hard, unyielding constraints of our reality, our bodies and our mortality. The other side is the infinite, our spirit, our boundless capacity for freedom and imagining alternative futures. When these two factors fall out of balance, the self suffers an ontological failure. If completely absorbed in infinite imagination or totally crushed by finite necessity, a structural misrelation occurs. This tearing of the self is despair. Kierkegaard calls it the sickness unto death. It is a terminal spiritual condition where the individual cannot find equilibrium through thought alone. To cure this sickness, the individual must navigate through distinct spheres of existence. The first is the aesthetic sphere. Here, a person is governed entirely by sensory input, impulse, and the pursuit of immediate pleasure. Kierkegaard uses the archetype of Don Juan to illustrate this stage. The aesthete constantly flits from one novelty to the next, sampling every experience specifically to avoid the heavy burden of a fixed permanent identity. They strive for what Hegel termed a bad infinity, the total absence of limitations. By refusing to commit to anyone or anything, they keep all their options open indefinitely. But eventually, the sheer volume of choices loses its flavor. When the novelty is exhausted, the aesthete is left staring into a paralyzing void of meaninglessness. By aggressively avoiding commitment, the aesthete dissolves into formless despair. At this point, the sickness cannot be cured by pursuing pleasure, nor reasoned away. The only escape is a leap. This requires a violent, willed act of self-commitment, propelling the individual into the structured world of duty. This new stage is the ethical sphere. Here, the individual willingly submits to universal moral standards. They accept obligations, define their boundaries, and bring strict consistency to their life. The archetype here is Socrates, the tragic hero. He constructs his identity by perfectly aligning his actions with universal reason and the unwritten laws of morality, even to the point of sacrificing his own life. The ethical life grants the individual form and substance. It allows them to trust in their own moral self-sufficiency, confident that strength of will is enough to overcome human weakness. Yet this system also breaks down. Inevitably, the ethical person realizes their own inability to perfectly execute the moral law. This failure introduces an acute awareness of guilt and sin. A rigid, universal system of ethics operates like a mathematical equation. It cannot forgive. It lacks the capacity to process the specific, absolute weight of an individual's failure. Ethical despair is far heavier than the boredom of the aesthete. It forces the individual to confront their complete lack of self-sufficiency before a standard they are incapable of meeting. To resolve the despair of guilt, the individual must make one final leap into the religious sphere, a domain that operates entirely outside the boundaries of universal moral law. This marks a total break from Hegel. In the Hegelian system, stepping outside the universal ethical norm is the very definition of sin. For Kierkegaard, it is the only viable path to God. Kierkegaard points to Abraham to demonstrate the teleological suspension of the ethical. He is commanded to sacrifice his son, an act violating all reason. This creates the ultimate paradox. Ethically, Abraham is a murderer, but religiously, he is a man of faith, operating in a direct, unmediated relationship with the Creator. There is no rational proof to validate this command. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is an objective uncertainty. It is not a comforting conclusion, but a terrifying, absolute risk. The religious sphere resolves despair by relating the finite individual directly to the absolute. It is a connection that completely bypasses the safe, predictable machinery of rational calculation. When we view these spheres together, we see a fractured landscape. A lived human life is disjointed, separated by chasms of anxiety and decision. Hegel attempted to bridge these massive gulfs with logic, smoothing over the contradictions of existence. But in doing so, he left us with nothing but the pale ghost of hypostatus thought. Moving through the stages of life cannot be achieved through logical mediation. They are qualitative leaps, requiring the willed commitment of the entire person. The leap into faith is never permanently secured. It is not a theorem you solve once and file away. It is a choice that must be constantly, actively repeated. Self-actualization is a continuous process of becoming. Because we are inherently free, the tension of the leap is never fully resolved. We are forced to make these profound existential choices in a world that refuses to offer us rational proofs or safety nets. To be an existing individual, in the Kierkegaardian sense, is to accept the relentless anxiety of your own freedom. There is no mathematical formula to cure the sickness unto death. Navigating it requires choosing the passion of the leap, day after day, against the backdrop of an absurd world.